The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, I ask all members participating remotely to keep themselves muted when they are not being recognized. We will conclude today's hearing at 12:15 p.m. Members who were unable to ask questions at our September 30th hearing with Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell will be given priority to ask their questions today, and we will return to our normal order of recognition once these members have asked their questions. This hearing is entitled Oversight of the Treasury Department's and Federal Reserve's Pandemic Response. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Welcome back, Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell. As this pandemic continues, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats remain hard at work to provide protections and essential relief to individuals, families, and small businesses across the country. The emergence of the new Omicron variant shows us that this crisis is not over, and we must remain vigilant to protect our country and our families from the devastation of COVID-19. Since Democrats have been in power, we have delivered for the American public. Democrats provided rental relief for struggling renters, provided 70,000 vouchers to address homelessness, provided support to state and local governments, and helped our nation's restaurants. Democrats helped businesses reopen, prioritize vaccine distribution, and because of this work, 74.5% of individuals 5 years and older have received at least one shot. In fact, this Thanksgiving was the first time since the pandemic began that many of us spent time in person with our friends and families. Under President Biden's leadership, the economy has created 5.6 million jobs, more than any other administration's first 9 months, and weekly jobless claims recently fell to 199,000, the lowest total in more than 50 years. But our work does not stop at pandemic relief. We also enacted landmark bipartisan infrastructure legislation, an achievement that has eluded Republican and Democratic presidents alike for decades. Under President Biden, we now have the funding in place and the programs to finally rebuild and refit our nation's bridges, roads, and railways, and bring broadband to millions. And soon, the Build Back Better Act will make long overdue investments in the nation's affordable housing infrastructure, child care, and education workforce. I hope that our Senate colleagues move quickly to send this bill to the president's desk. While these investments will be critical, the Fed's unfinished objectives of full employment and price stability serve as a reminder that we must not leave anyone behind during this recovery. Chair Powell has identified supply chain bottlenecks and ongoing caregiving needs as two of the major barriers to continued economic recovery. Congressional Democrats have responded by passing bills that invest in child care and help clear those bottlenecks. It is crucial that the Fed hold off on declaring a premature victory on this economic recovery until the communities that have been hit the hardest, people of color, renters who fell behind on their rent, and women who have done the bulk of the caregiving, have a chance to experience the recovery. If we're truly to build back better, we must ensure that people of color are represented in the Fed's leadership. We must make sure that people's caregiving needs are met so that they can pursue new opportunities in education, clean energy, and more. We must address the root causes of rising prices by investing in housing and supply chain resilience. Secretary Yellen, Chair Powell, I look forward to discussing your ongoing work to respond to the pandemic. I will now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chair Powell, congratulations on your renomination. I'm glad to see President Biden recognizes what I've said all along, is that you've earned and deserve another term leading the Federal Reserve. Under your leadership, the Fed took decisive and unprecedented action to prevent the COVID-related economic challenges from becoming an economic or financial crisis for Americans. But there's more work to be done. We need to unwind these firefighting measures and turn our focus to rebuilding the economy, which, thanks to pro-growth Republican policies, was the greatest in our lifetimes just prior to the pandemic. It's the Fed's job to look at and evaluate the macroeconomic picture. It's not their job to respond to each and every variant. But it's not just the pandemic that is posing a threat to our full recovery. It's Democrats' bad fiscal policy decisions that is driving inflation. Right before Thanksgiving, House Democrats passed another massive multi-trillion-dollar spending bill. Our economy is feeling the full force of that politically motivated decision. Look at the job market. In September, job openings and labor turnover survey reported more than 10 million unfilled jobs, remaining near a record high. 4.4 million people quit their jobs, an all-time high. Labor shortages continue to hold back growth and weaken the backbone of our economy, small businesses. And instead of seeking bipartisan solutions to support working parents as we continue to manage COVID, Democrats opted for unworkable mandates. The NFIB's small business survey for October showed the economic outlook deteriorating to its lowest level since November 2012. Our labor force participation rate has stagnated since June 2020. What do these things have in common? All these issues have in common bad fiscal policy, not a question of monetary policy. Nearly half of small businesses report they had job openings unfilled. They were not able to even get qualified applicants to. 58% indicated they had few or no qualified applicants, in fact. Look at consumer prices. From a year ago through October, the headline CPI rose to 6.2%, the largest annual increase in 30 years. Consumer sentiment for November dropped to its lowest level in a decade. In fact, American families just experienced the most expensive Thanksgiving on record. Now, Democrats want to blame increased prices on American businesses or some other force. It's their policies. It's their policies. It's coming from inside the House. It's coming from inside the Senate. It's coming from inside this administration. They're driving up costs for the American people. In fact, in October, the San Francisco Fed released a report showing that Democrat policies are harming our recovery. So what do House Democrats do? Well, they spend more money. That was the big vote in just before Thanksgiving. More money. That's pouring jet fuel onto an inflationary trajectory we have in the economy. Well, speaking of fuel, though, just look at gas prices. This is the bad policies from this administration. When you shut off American energy sources, it drives up the cost of petrochemicals in our economy. And outsourcing that to OPEC actually makes us more dependent on other foreign sources. So, as important as it is for us to hear from both of you today, in fact, this is the final remnant of the CARES Act, the fact that you two are mandated to come and appear before us on a quarterly basis about programs that have now been rescinded, but this is the final remnant of the CARES Act, which was, by the way, a bipartisan bill passed through the House and the Senate and signed by the President last year. But we look forward to hearing from you today about this broad economic question that we're all very concerned about. And as we discuss these policies and what we're doing to address them, I hope that we can talk about solutions, not just the problem. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 1 minute. Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the Fed is a lender of last resort, and I compliment the Fed for what it's done under its 13-3 authority to create 9 emergency facilities, 7 of which were supported by funds from the Treasury. But I'd also like to make a note. Today, currently, unemployment for African American workers is 7.9% and 5.9% for Latino workers, higher than the national average of 4.6% and 4% for whites. Hence, today we must ask, in view of how unemployment rates still vary dramatically across races, what more can the Federal Reserve do as a lender of last resort to advance its mandate to foster economic conditions that achieve both maximum employment and stable prices, not just for some, but for all? What can regulators do, not only to continue to bolster the economic recovery, but also the pandemic? We have to deal with it and reduce the insecurity as it relates to the wealth gap. I look forward to hearing the witnesses respond to this and other questions.
I now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My constituents just experienced the most expensive Thanksgiving dinner in history. A 16-pound turkey is up 23%. Costco pumpkin pie is up 17%. A 2-pound bag of carrots is up nearly 50%. Let's also not forget the outrageous prices at the pump, making it too expensive for many Americans to drive home and celebrate Thanksgiving with their families in the first place. This inflation is not transitory, as our witnesses finally acknowledged yesterday. And it's not a high-class problem, despite what the Biden administration will tell you. That is a lie propagated by those who have never had to do mental math at the grocery store to make sure the amount in their cart does not exceed the cash in their wallet. For Democrat leaders, paying 42% more at the pump probably isn't a problem when you're riding a government-funded high-speed rail in Silicon Valley. More than 90% of my constituents reported that rising prices were impacting their household budgets. Inflation is destroying Americans' ability to save for retirement, buy a home, or build wealth. This isn't a tax on the rich, it's an enormous burden on working Americans. We must stop this reckless spending before it financially cripples our nation. I yield back the balance of my time.
I want to welcome our distinguished witnesses today who need little introduction to members of the committee. First, I want to welcome the Honorable Janet Yellen, Secretary of the United States Department of the Treasury, who has served in that role since her confirmation in January of this year. Our other distinguished witness today is the Honorable Jerome Powell, the Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and who has served in that role since February of 2018. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. You will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. You should be able to see a timer that will indicate how much time you have left in your testimony. Secretary Yellen, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the committee, it's a pleasure to testify today. November has been a very significant month for our economy, and Congress is a large part of the reason why. Our economy has needed updated roads, ports, and broadband networks for many years now, and I'm very grateful that on the night of November 5th, members of both parties came together to pass the largest infrastructure package in American history. November 5th, it turned out, was a particularly consequential day because earlier that morning, we received a very favorable jobs report, 531,000 jobs added. It's never wise to make too much of one piece of economic data, but in this case, it was in addition to a mounting body of evidence that points to a clear conclusion. Our economic recovery is on track. We're averaging 500,000 new jobs per month since January. GDP now exceeds its pre-pandemic levels. Our unemployment rate is at its lowest level since the start of the pandemic, and our economy is on pace to reach full employment 2 years faster than the Congressional Budget Office had estimated. Of course, the progress of our economic recovery can't be separated from our progress against the pandemic. And I know that we're all following the news about the Omicron variant. As the president said, we're still waiting for more data, but what remains true is that our best protection against the virus is the vaccine. People should get vaccinated and boosted. At this point, I'm confident that our recovery remains strong and is even quite remarkable when put in context. We should not forget that last winter, there was a risk that our economy was going to slip into prolonged recession. And there is an alternate reality where right now, millions more people cannot find a job or are losing the roofs over their heads. It's clear that what has separated us from that counterfactual are the bold relief measures Congress has enacted during the crisis: the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and the American Rescue Plan. And it's not just the passage of these laws that's made the difference, but their effective implementation. Treasury, as you know, was tasked with administering a large portion of the relief funds provided by Congress under those bills. During our last quarterly hearing, I spoke extensively about the state and local relief program, but I wanted to update you on some other measures. First, the American Rescue Plan's expanded child tax credit has been sent out every month since July, putting about $77 billion in the pockets of families of more than 61 million children. Families are using these funds for essential needs like food. And in fact, according to the Census Bureau, food insecurity among families with children dropped 24% after the July payments, which is a profound economic and moral victory for the country. Meanwhile, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program has significantly expanded, providing much-needed assistance to over 2 million households. This assistance has helped keep eviction rates below pre-pandemic levels. This month, we also released guidelines for the $10 billion State Small Business Credit Initiative Program, which will provide targeted lending and investments that will help small businesses grow and create well-paying jobs. As consequential as November was, December promises to be more so. There are two decisions facing Congress that could send our economy in very different directions. The first is the debt limit. I cannot overstate how critical it is that Congress address this issue. America must pay its bills on time and in full. If we do not, we will eviscerate our current recovery. In a matter of days, the majority of Americans would suffer financial pain as critical payments like Social Security checks and military paychecks would not reach their bank accounts, and that would likely be followed by a deep recession. The second action involves the Build Back Better legislation. I applaud the House for passing the bill, and I'm hopeful that the Senate will soon follow. Build Back Better is the right economic decision for many reasons. It will, for example, end the child care crisis in this country, letting parents return to work. These investments, we expect, will lead to a GDP increase over the long term without increasing the national debt or deficit by $1. In fact, the offsets in these bills mean they actually reduce annual deficits over time. Thanks to your work, we have ensured that America will recover from this pandemic. Now, with this bill, we have the chance to ensure America thrives in a post-pandemic world. With that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Chair Powell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The economy has continued to strengthen. It's on. It's on already. Can you hear me?
No, I cannot. Is his mic on, please?
Bright red talk button is on.
Yes,
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
How's that?
yes, that's better.
Okay, sorry. Starting over. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The economy has continued to strengthen. The rise in Delta variant cases temporarily slowed progress this past summer, restraining previously rapid growth in household and business spending, intensifying supply chain disruptions, and in some cases, keeping people from returning to work or looking for a job. Fiscal and monetary policy and the healthy financial positions of households and businesses continue to support aggregate demand. Recent data suggests that the post-September decline in cases corresponded to a pickup in economic growth. GDP appears on track to grow about 5% in 2021, the fastest pace in many years. As with overall economic activity, conditions in the labor market have continued to improve. The Delta variant contributed to slower job growth this summer as factors related to the pandemic, such as caregiving needs and fears of the virus, kept some people out of the labor force despite strong demand for workers. Nonetheless, October saw job growth of 531,000, and the unemployment rate fell to 4.6%, indicating a rebound in the pace of labor market improvement. There is still ground to cover to reach maximum employment for both employment and labor force participation, and we expect progress to continue. The economic downturn has not fallen equally, and those least able to shoulder the burden have been the hardest hit. In particular, despite progress, joblessness continues to fall disproportionately on African Americans and Hispanics. Pandemic-related supply and demand imbalances have contributed to notable price increases in some areas. Supply chain problems have made it difficult for producers to meet strong demand, particularly for goods. Increases in energy prices and rents are also pushing inflation upward. As a result, overall inflation is running well above our 2% longer-run goal, with the PCE price index up 5% over the 12 months ending in October. Most forecasters, including at the Fed, continue to expect that inflation will move down significantly over the next year as supply and demand imbalances abate. It is difficult to predict the persistence and effects of supply constraints, but it now appears that factors pushing inflation upward will linger well into next year. In addition, with the rapid improvement in the labor market, slack is diminishing and wages are rising at a brisk pace. We understand that high inflation imposes significant burdens, especially on those less able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are committed to our price stability goal. We will use our tools both to support the economy and a strong labor market and to prevent higher inflation from becoming entrenched. The recent rise in COVID-19 cases and the emergence of the Omicron variant pose downside risks to employment and economic activity and increased uncertainty for inflation. Greater concerns about the virus could reduce people's willingness to work in person, which would slow progress in the labor market and intensify supply chain disruptions. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to support a full recovery in employment and achieve our price stability goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. As the pandemic was raging last year, many members of this committee suggested that for all the pain and disruption that the virus was causing, Americans would respond with strength, creativity, and ingenuity, as we have done in other crises. That is a guiding principle behind building back better. It is not enough to just get back to the way things were before. We must shape a recovery that builds a new, stronger, and more equitable economy for the future. So let's talk about the progress we're making. Chair Powell, The American Rescue Plan that passed in March helped accelerate vaccinations and reopenings over the last 9 months. The economy has added over 5.6 million jobs, and workers have started to see meaningful wage growth for the first time in decades. Do you view these wage growth trends as positive? How does your economic recovery compare with other major economies? And do you still think that inflation will be temporary? And if so, why?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So on wages, we have seen wages moving up significantly. And at this point, of course, we like to see wages move up. Everyone likes to see wages move up. That's how incomes rise generation to generation. And so particularly at the lower end of the wage spectrum, we are seeing wages move up. At this point, we don't see them moving up at a troubling rate that would tend to spark higher inflation, but that's something we're watching very carefully. In terms of other economies, our recovery is the strongest. It's stronger than the others. We've had we had stronger fiscal support, frankly, and so part of it is that. But our recovery is really the farthest advanced of any of the largest ones. In terms of the temporary nature of inflation, I would say that the inflation that we're seeing is still clearly connected to to pandemic-related factors. I would also add, though, that it has spread more broadly in the economy, and I think that the risk of persistent higher inflation has clearly risen. And I think that our policy has adapted to that and will continue to adapt.
If you could expound a little bit more on what is happening. I remember when we first started to talk about inflation, we basically all talked about it in terms of it being transitory. And I think that what you just alluded to relative to how the economy will act or recover, are you directly talking about stimulating the economy with, for example, Build Back Better, and that will help with the inflation that we're experiencing?
Well, I do think that forecasters at the Fed and around pretty much all forecasters do expect that inflation will move down over the second half of next year, closer to our longer run goal of 2%. But as I mentioned, we've seen inflation be more persistent. We've seen the factors that are causing higher inflation be more persistent. There, I'm thinking of the combination of very high demand, but also the supply side difficulties that we're having with blockages and that sort of thing, and shortages. In terms of the effects of the Build Back Better bill, that's not something that it's appropriate for me to comment on.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, when you were Fed chair, you were known for looking beyond the top-line unemployment rate to other figures like the rate of employees quitting, the so-called quits rate, to determine whether the economy was reaching full employment. The quits rate has surpassed previous records, leading some to label what has happened in the economy as the Great Resignation. When Chair Powell testified in our committee in July, he identified child care and school closures as one of the biggest barriers to further labor market recovery. Can you explain what the quit rate tells us about the economy today? And do you believe that the investments that the Build Back Better Act would make in child care and universal pre-K help with this?
Well, the quit rate, when it is high, and as you mentioned, it's the highest it's been in the history of this series, it signifies a tight labor market, one where workers are leaving their jobs because they feel confident about their ability to get others, often are getting outside offers and feel good about the labor market, and that's what we have, and we see it reflected in surveys of workers who feel that jobs are plentiful. And of course, businesses almost universally complain now about the difficulty of hiring workers. But this is a very unusual shock that's hit the economy. And at the same time, we see that a large number of workers have their participation in the labor force has declined, and it hasn't yet gotten back up to normal levels. In some cases, it's because there were early retirements, and of course, the pandemic did result in, unfortunately, a large death toll. But I think there is still many people who, especially low-income workers, who don't feel confident that about the health consequences of working, especially in face-to-face type jobs. And so those people are still out of the labor force. And I think as we get greater control over the pandemic, the supply of workers will increase as those people come back to work.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is a ranking member of the committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Powell, the last time we were here, in fact, both in September and July, I asked you about this. The Fed incorporates new spending from the fiscal house, from Congress and the White House. They incorporate that into projections, right? And the effects of your monetary decisions with the knowns of fiscal policy. And at the time, you said this twice before, I think you'll say it again, but a lot depends on the details. Certainly you incorporate that information, but a lot depends on the details. Is that still true?
Yes.
Okay. So in light of that, we had in February a Democrat-only proposal that made it into law that spent $2 trillion. And then we have, just last week, another bill the administration supports that enhances the deficit according to the Congressional Budget Office, raises the deficit by $400 billion. And so we have those two large fiscal pieces here. When Chair Waters asked, Secretary Yellen, when Chair Waters asked the chairman of the Federal Reserve whether or not spending more money from the fiscal house will improve inflation, I think what she asks, instead of improve, I want to translate for the public. When a Democrat says improve inflation, it means enhance or raise inflation, just to be clear, okay? So my friends on the left, when they say improve inflation, they want more of it. So, Secretary Yellen, to this point, now these things are imprecise, policymaking is imprecise, but back in February, there was an output gap this administration acknowledged, right, in economic projections, and came to Congress for a fiscal stimulus in the name of COVID, but a fiscal stimulus, right? Is it fair to say that maybe you overshot in February?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we had a sizable fiscal stimulus. We were very concerned that the most significant risk facing the American economy was a shortage of jobs and a prolonged downturn that would scar many people, particularly the most
But in
vulnerable.
February, the output gap, right, versus what the fiscal stimulus was that your administration pushed for and got, perhaps you overshot. Is that fair to say? Is that a fair assumption?
Well, I don't think that's a fair assumption.
It's not. So Jason
we
Furman
addressed what
and
was a very substantial risk, and as Chair Powell just mentioned, the United States.
okay.
has
So
had
you
the
think that
fastest
fiscal
recovery
reclaiming
of
my
any-
time, Madam Chair.
Now, look, the inflation.
I'm asking a very particular question about the output gap. The output gap at the beginning of the year was $300 to $400 billion, right? Economists on the left and right were saying that that was about right.
I think it was extremely hard under the circumstances to have any
Okay,
certainty.
and I'm asking a very reasonable
about
question.
What
As
was
a
the output
policymaker,
gap.
okay, as a policymaker, I'm just asking you, you're a noted economist, right, who's chaired the Federal Reserve. You're now in a very different position, having to, I think, sell what is a pretty lousy economic agenda, but you're doing a great job trying to sell this administration's agenda. The economic question that I hear from economists on the left now is that, and your former San Francisco Fed even acknowledges, that February stimulus contributed to the inflation we're now experiencing.
Well, look, inflation...
Is that a fair assumption or
Look,
not?
Inflation is a matter of demand and supply, and it's certainly true that the American Rescue Plan put money in people's pockets, helped them meet expenses that they had, and contributed to strong demand in the U.S. economy. But if you look at the amount of inflation that we have and its causes, that is at most a small contributor. The pandemic and what it's done to supply chains, diverting demand away from services and massively onto goods, which has resulted in supply chain problems and the impact we have seen that's now been long-lasting on labor's supply due to the pandemic. I would say those are very important
But there's a distinction
factors.
here between a supply shock and a demand issue, right? Is that fair to understand?
The recovery plan did boost demand, and that's one reason that most households are in a favorable financial position, much better than they otherwise would have been, and it's enabled their spending. But the fact that the spending, because of the pandemic, has been so focused on goods as opposed to services has contributed massively to the supply chain problems
Okay.
that are boosting prices.
So, Madam Secretary, Chairman Powell, the Congress and the public and this administration wants to point everything onto the Federal Reserve on inflation. That is simply not the case. It is the multiple trillions of dollars that this Congress and this administration is spending that's putting jet fuel on the fires of this economy. It is making things worse. It is the policies of this administration. The chair went over time, and I'm going over time as well. So let me just say this. It is the administration's agenda here that I will finish my sentence here, Madam Chair, okay? It is the administration's agenda that is driving up the cost of things. It is making the American people worse off, not better off. Inflation is outpacing wage increases. This is on the Democrat House, Senate, and White House. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, too, for your service. I'm way over here today. Couple things. I'm listening to the publicans talk about inflation, but I think a more important topic we should be talking about is the fact that since the ex-president Trump was defeated by Joe Biden in November of last year, we've added almost 6 million jobs, some 620,000 jobs per month. And we've seen the stock market rise from 26,000 to 36,000. Now it's backed off to about 35,000 in the last year at $1.4 billion per point. It's almost up $13 trillion since Joe Biden won the election last year. We've seen GDP up dramatically over the last year. And my friends, I appreciate that the Republicans want to talk about inflation because that's all they can talk about. So I'd like to ask my first question of you, Secretary Yellen. Unemployment is falling at the fastest rate in 50 years and is now at 4.6%. Prior to the American Rescue Plan passing, the Congressional Budget Office projected it would take until the fourth quarter of 2023 to get to 4.6% unemployment. So we're 2 years ahead. Madam Secretary, my question is on Build Back Better, and how will it help in terms of the recovery and create more opportunities for everyday Americans?
Well, thank you for that question. Build Back Better is really focused on addressing long-term issues in our economy that have been holding back economic growth and contributing to economic inequality. An important aspect of Build Back Better is what it does for children and households with children. 2 years of universal early childhood education for 3- and 4-year-olds, and subsidies for childcare to make quality childcare affordable for the great majority of households, along with a continuation, at least for a year, of the child tax credit that has made it possible for so many families to support the needs of their children, keep roofs over their heads, and diminished food insecurity. And these childcare provisions, as well as other parts of the program, should serve to boost labor force participation, particularly of women, where we've lagged behind most other developed countries. And research suggests that our failure to provide adequate child care and paid family leave is an important contributor. In addition,
Let me change the subject for 1 second, just to a subject that I've asked both of you about in the past, the Safe Banking Act, which involves allowing financial institutions to provide financial services to the cannabis industry and those that serve the cannabis industry. And you may know that we passed it with big bipartisan votes out of this committee, off the floor to the Senate last cycle. This cycle, we amended the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's just to remind you where we are. In October, Cassidy Collins, a senior counsel in the Office of the Chief Counsel of the IRS, noted the special type of collection challenge the IRS undertakes regarding tax collection from cannabis-related businesses forced to operate in cash only. It's estimated that in just 3 states, nearly $50 million in taxes went unassessed because of unique issues surrounding the cannabis industry. Madam Secretary, do you agree? If these businesses were simply allowed to access the banking system and didn't have to transact business only in cash, it would make the IRS's job easier.
yes, of course it would.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell, thank you for joining us today. And as I expressed to you earlier, Chair Powell, I want to congratulate you again on your renomination for another term leading the Federal Reserve Board, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. Chair Powell, you responded that our best expectation, this is your quote, our best expectation is there will be modest upward pressure on prices this year, but they won't be particularly large or persistent in the future. Chair Powell, since that hearing 8 months ago, I have asked you about higher inflation, and yes, to my good friend, the gentleman from Colorado, we're going to talk about inflation. That's all that people are talking about in my district, Missouri's 2nd Congressional District. They want to know why these prices keep going higher and higher and higher and higher. And no, I don't believe it's necessarily to fall at the foot of the Fed blame. It is Democrat policies and overspending. But I digress. I asked you about higher inflation 2 more times, sir, and Americans have experienced surging increases in, as I said, food, fuel, housing, leading up to the most expensive Thanksgiving, Christmas, and holiday season on record. Is it your view, sir, that these price increases still aren't, quote, particularly large or persistent?
No, that is no longer my view.
Thank you for that answer. Chair Powell, yesterday in the Senate Banking Committee, you stated that you believe it's time to retire the word transitory. I couldn't agree more. And to explain more clearly what the Fed means when referring to transitory inflation. I think most Americans, sir, define transitory as temporary, but the strain on their monthly budgets and paychecks from this inflation does not seem transitory or temporary. If that's not what you mean, then could you explain the Fed's meaning, please?
Sure. So the word transitory to some, as you suggest, has a sense of short-lived, a matter of months kind of thing. Whereas when we're using it in a specific way to say that transitory to us means that this episode, however lengthy it is, will not leave a persistent, long-run string of high inflation behind it. And the problem, you know, our whole role that we play, it really revolves around having clear communication. When you have a word that means different things to different people, we just need to move on and find a better way to explain ourselves. And, you know, most forecasters still do think, overwhelmingly believe that inflation will come down significantly in the second half of next year. But as I've said, you know, the risks of higher inflation have moved up. Higher, more persistent
Is
inflation have moved up.
soaring debt and deficits and excessive spending and dumping stimulus spending after stimulus spending after stimulus spending into our economy, will that be a driver of inflation?
So I guess I would say, I don't want to comment on you know, fiscal policy directly.
I'm just
but
saying in general.
in general, so if you go back to last March, the median of the blue chip, the best resourced forecasters thought that inflation would be right about at our target, March of this year. What was wrong with that analysis was really that we understood demand would be strong. We didn't understand how the significant problems of the supply side, which are very hard, they were unique. We
And
haven't
how
seen
much
them before.
money there would be in households and in the
Demand is
system.
very, very strong, both from no question, from fiscal policy and also from
Fiscal policy,
the
I
quickly
agree.
rebounding economy. The economy is very strong now.
I agree. So, Secretary Yellen, let me ask you, the CBO, and they reflect one of the more conservative scores, has said that Biden's spending bill, the most recent one, will add $367 billion to the deficit. Could you describe the long-term consequences of too much fiscal spending on financial markets and the price of consumer goods?
So let me first put the CBO number that you mentioned in perspective. They did score Build Back Better as resulting in $367
Yes.
billion in deficits over 10 years, not in a year, but over 10 years.
Well, there were a lot of gimmicks that went through to
However-
get that number, too.
However,
Let's be honest.
the score, that score, they made clear, does not include the revenue that will come from enhancement of resources for tax enforcement. It doesn't include that.
How does
And
this
Treasury-
overspending
Treasury-
on our financial markets
Gentlewoman's time has
deal with the
expired.
price of consumer goods? I'd like the
Gentlewoman's-
gentlelady to
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And I'd like to thank Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell for being here with us on such an important occasion at this critical moment, and talk about a couple of questions of issues that we have that have affected our district. My first question is to Secretary Yellen. Secretary, when you testified before this committee in July, you identified caregiving needs as one of the major barriers people face in getting back to work following the COVID pandemic. Studies, over 80% of South Texans residing in my congressional district identify as Latino, but only 19.5% of 3- and 4-year-olds are enrolled in publicly funded preschool. What impact do you think Build Back Better Act will have in supporting our economic recovery and getting folks back to work? I know we're talking about this labor shortage, but specifically, do you believe investing in childcare and universal pre-K will bolster our economic and labor market recovery?
Yes, I absolutely do. As I mentioned previously, one of the reasons that even before the pandemic, women's labor force participation in the United States fell short of that in many developed countries is the lack of public support for childcare and paid family leave. And during the pandemic, this became so much worse because of the issues in childcare and schools not being open, but many childcare facilities closed, and people who work in childcare that involves face-to-face contact health concerns have held people back from going to work there. So Build Back Better will subsidize childcare so that it's affordable for almost all American families, and provide 2 years of universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds. And research that Treasury recently summarized in a working paper shows that this will boost labor supply, particularly that of women. And more recently, the Congressional Budget Office also published a paper that opines that this is likely to have positive impacts on employment.
Thank you. And as you know, in the CARES Act we established the Paycheck Protection Program, which has been administered by the SBA in concert with Treasury to provide economic relief and emergency payroll support to small businesses hit most by the pandemic. The program provided a lifeline for many small businesses in my district and across the country. But however, we reached a struggle to reach businesses in communities of color. And as I mentioned earlier, over 80% of my district is Latino, and over 19,000 businesses applied for PPP. Only 23.25% identified as Latino. How can we look at this information and learn how to better reach minority-owned businesses to ensure they have the same access to these resources? And what are we doing to make this happen?
Yes. Well, I mean, in the more recent payroll protection program, priority was given to CDFIs and MDIs to have access to those funds in order to provide better support to minority areas. And going forward, Congress has provided considerable resources to CDFIs and to MDIs. And what we've found is that these institutions have great ability to reach businesses in underserved areas. So the CDFI program that we run in Treasury is very focused on making sure that that support gets out, and we expect these institutions to play a significant role in the state small business credit initiative that we recently issued guidelines for.
Thank you. And lastly, I just want to ask a question on the Emergency Capital Investment Program that was established and consolidated on the Appropriations Act of 2021 to encourage low and moderate income community financial institutions to bolster their efforts to support and engage with small businesses in their communities. I understand the deadline to submit application
The gentleman's
for the
time
program
has
was
expired.
Okay, thank you.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Chairman Powell, I'm sure you're familiar with Milton Friedman's treatise, Free to Choose.
Yes.
And this is an important, college textbook, I would think, on economics. And I would commend Chapter 9 to you, The Cure for Inflation. It is, I think it is, Mr. Friedman lays out some important premises of what creates inflation. And I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the M2 money supply has gone up very dramatically. You're familiar with the Federal Reserve holdings and trillions of dollars of debt, the very dramatic increase on your balance sheet. I know you're aware of this because you were there. And the money in circulation. And this comports with, again, going back to Chapter 9 of Milton Friedman's book, and he goes in and talks about the inflation that took place in the 1970s, and he has a series of charts showing the supply of money. So here's the United States, and he goes on and shows the supply of money in Germany and Japan and the increase in prices, and then also the United Kingdom and Brazil. And so all of this is going to a very central point that when you increase money, and actually let me quote Mr. Friedman here for a second. When the quantity of money increases more rapidly than the quantity of goods and services available for purchase, we have inflation. You have printed too much money, sir, and that money has created inflation. to stop the inflation, I would recommend to you to stop printing the money. You indicated yesterday that you're going to start to slow down the printing of money. I think you should stop it, and stop it right now. Inflation is on the minds of Americans. Poll after poll for the last many months, 70, 80% of Americans, it's a top issue for them. They're concerned about inflation. Inflation is eating away their purchasing power. It is actually robbing them of the increases in wages that we've seen because their purchasing power is down because of the inflation that's created by the money that's being printed. Would you like to respond to that?
Sure. So price stability is one of our two goals, the other being maximum employment. We have to balance those two goals when they're in tension, as they are right now, but I assure you we will use our tools to make sure that this high inflation we're experiencing does not become entrenched. If I may also add, though, the connection between monetary aggregates and either growth or inflation was very strong for a long, long time, which ended about 40 years ago. So the so-called velocity of money became quite variable. And so now we think more of just the imbalances between supply and demand in the real economy rather than monetary aggregates, which isn't to say that that was wrong when written. I think it was probably correct when it was written, but it's been a different economy and a different financial system for some time. Nonetheless, your point on inflation, well taken.
Well, and I appreciate that. And I just, Secretary Yellen, don't you think that the deficit spending that this administration, on an unparalleled level, right? I mean, the $2 trillion in deficit spending in February, dumping money into the economy, has created the inflation that we see today?
Well, the Build Back Better plan that's under consideration now is paid for.
Okay, but the $2 trillion in February, was that paid for?
The rescue plan was not paid for.
Okay, so that's
It
$2
did
trillion in
involve-
deficit spending.
There was a very good reason to pass that. We faced a major risk in terms of seeing our workforce, particularly the most vulnerable members of the American society, scarred permanently, losing homes, being unable to put food on their tables, take care of their children, and being permanently financially harmed, as well as there was a shortage of demand in the economy that could have resulted in long-lasting joblessness and high unemployment. And the plan that was enacted into law was focused on dealing with that, and it's been successful.
Did it create
But
inflation? Did $2 trillion of deficit spending create inflation?
It did boost demand, and that is one of several factors that are involved in inflation. But we, absent the pandemic and the supply chain problems we've had and the negative impact the pandemic has
Secretary
had
Yellen,
on the supply of labor.
What's interesting
wouldn't be
Secretary Yellen, if I could just to finish here, what's interesting is that Milton Friedman wrote in 1979, no government is willing to accept responsibility for producing inflation. And you, ma'am, have just embodied that denial because your spending, your deficit spending is creating the inflation that the Americans need relief from now. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to begin by clarifying the fact that the deficit spending just referred to was to address the pandemic concerns that was impacting this country. The unemployment of our people, the fact that there were so many businesses that needed support, and one of the reasons why we enacted the relief packages that we did was to make sure that we didn't collapse our economy as a result of these pandemic circumstances. So let's make sure we're bifurcating the issues here and not just hammering away on, what happened in the past and trying to tie it into the present. And with that, I'd like to talk about the present. It looks like the narrative of the minority is to try and pin the inflationary circumstances of this country on the fiscal policy that's being pursued by the sitting government. And I think it's important for us to remember that just a few months ago, the very same minority in similar hearings as this was stating that they were upset that the rollout of relief funding was not happening fast enough. That's entirely juxtaposed to the inflationary arguments being presented today. they were arguing for us to push even more money into the financial system, into the monetary supply. So, I really hope that we can go back to that mentality, because getting help to the American people during the pandemic was and is a priority, and continuing to get help to the American people in our infrastructure and in the many good things in Build Back Better should also continue to be a priority. It needs to further be reminded that Build Back Better has not even been enacted yet. Its fiscal impacts have not been materialized. It's not entering into the money supply. And we've recently just had testimony that inflation is running at a certain clip up to October. I believe it was mentioned by Chairman Powell at 5%. And I think that that's important for us to contextualize, because we are suffering from inflation, but the inflationary pressures are not as a result of the recently passed Build Back Better that still remains to be enacted. That being said, I would like, without objections, Madam Chair, to enter to the record an article dated October 15, 2021 by Paul Hannon in London, Brian Dube in Lima, and Stella Yifan Shi in Hong Kong on the Wall Street Journal, entitled "Inflation Surges Worldwide as COVID-19 Lockdowns End and Supply Chains Can't Cope." Without objections, Madam
Without
Chair.
objection is so ordered.
And in that vein, I'd like to pose a question to Chairman Powell. Mr. Chairman, is the inflation that we're enduring here in America today, is it just occurring in America, or is there a global inflationary environment?
So, as you mentioned, there's, if you look at Western Europe, Germany in particular, you look at the United Kingdom, look at Canada, you're seeing high rates of inflation in many of these countries, less so in Asia, but certainly in most parts of Europe and Canada and the United States.
And is it fair to state that these inflationary pressures that are occurring globally are predominantly as a result of the normalization that's starting to occur from the economies getting back on their feet due to the pandemic?
Yeah, so when you see something happening everywhere around the world, you look for common factors, and and those would be just the reopening of the economy, which imposes, COVID continues to impose supply side constraints. So whatever demand there is runs up against hard constraints, which is unusual for market economies. And you're seeing high inflation everywhere. You're seeing many of the same features that we're seeing here, you're seeing elsewhere, but different countries are feeling it to different degrees.
So just in that context, let's not hold back the American people by creating some kind of inflationary scare, making it seem like it's a fiscal policy issue. This is a global inflationary environment. Let's continue to take care of the American people while we allow the experts that are testifying before us today to continue guiding us as we try and tackle inflation. Moving on to Secretary Yellen, I want to first begin by recognizing some of your staff, JJ Richetti and Arian Rubio, special assistants that have been working closely with our office. They help us to do our job in engaging Treasury and allow you to come here today and do your job to be able to ask questions and answer questions directly from us. I just had one quick question, Secretary Yellen. My local governor is holding off on expending some resources that were provided under the local relief package. I think they're waiting to see what the final rule is on the spending of the local recovery funds. Is the final rule going to be materially different from the interim rule, or can we expect it to be materially the same?
Well, we're in the final stages of producing the final rule. It's undergoing review. We had thousands of comments and have tried to respond until that rule comes out, but we expect it to come out shortly. The interim rule applies and can be relied on.
The gentleman's time has expired. Just as a courtesy. Thank you. All members are instructed, if they have not exhausted their questions, of course, to submit in writing and follow up. At this time, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to Secretary Yellen and Chairman Powell for being here today. Thank you to Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry for holding this hearing. First, to start with you, Secretary Yellen, just now in response to Mr. Taylor's questioning, I believe you said that it's your position that the Build Back Better bill is fully paid for. Did I hear you correctly?
Well, let me be clear. We agree with the CBO analysis that led to a score of a $367 billion deficit over 10 years. but CBO was explicit that their analysis did not include revenue that would result from an $80 billion investment over 10 years in the IRS. And the Office of Tax Analysis issued a paper with our own estimate based on our data and information that we have from the IRS about the likely payoff from that, and we estimate that at $400 billion. So, and as when we put together those two pieces
got
of
you,
information,
Secretary. Thank
it
you.
is more than fully paid for.
I appreciate you clarifying. So the administration's position is that you believe that it's fully paid for by ramping up the amount of IRS agents that are out there by several tens of thousands and going after more Americans to try to get them to pay more in taxes. I believe the number is up over 80,000 more IRS agents, and we have some strong disagreement with regards to that proposal. I'm hearing from a lot of constituents who don't want to see several tens of thousands of additional IRS agents to be added to be going after hardworking Americans across the country, because we already have enough IRS agents out there to go after individuals. And they're also concerned with the proposal to be spying on bank accounts and transactions at low dollar amounts. Chairman Powell, you asked a question with regards to, you were talking about inflation, and I just want to understand this correctly. You said that the second half of next year that you believe that inflation will start coming down. Is that accurate that you stated that?
So our forecast, many, I'd say almost all forecasters do expect that inflation will be coming down meaningfully in the second half of next year. That's an expectation. That's a forecast.
And just so that I understand, is that something that you agree with?
I think it's likely, but I don't think, I mean, the point is we can't act as though we're sure of that. We're not at all sure of that. Inflation has been more persistent and higher than we've expected, and we have to use our policy to address the range of plausible outcomes, not just the most likely one, which is that one. That is the most likely, but there are other possibilities, and we're well aware of that.
And when you say that answer, I just want to understand that in the context of an additional question with regards to the Build Back Better bill. You were asked whether or not that would, what kind of an effect that would have on inflation, and you refused to comment on that. So my question is, the prediction that in the second half of next year that it's likely that inflation would come down, is that a prediction assuming that the Build Back Better bill is law or not law? Is that the trillions of dollars is spent or not spent?
You know, it's really not our role to comment on fiscal proposals indirectly or directly. So what we do.
That's not what I'm asking.
Well,
the prediction that that inflation is going to go down in the second half of next year is either built on an assumption that there is going to be trillions of dollars spent or not spent.
So
which assumption was used in making that
principal
prediction?
driving assumptions would be these: that the goods inflation that we're seeing will subside because the supply chain problems will sort themselves out. At the same time, though, you're going to see rent inflation going up, and you're going to see
I think you might be
wages pushing up.
misunderstanding me, Chairman. With all due respect, the prediction, I'm trying to understand whether or not.
So there will be a fiscal prediction. It will be in there. People will make different assumptions, but of course we will assume. At this point, we're assuming that something passes, but we don't know exactly what it's going to be. It's very hard to be precise because, again, we don't know what will pass.
That leaves far more questions than answers with regards to the prediction. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, who is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The House just passed the Build Back Better Act. We're closer than ever to delivering overdue support for workers, for families, and the economy. There's truly just so much for us to feel hopeful about. Unfortunately, many Republicans are working overtime to distract from these historic accomplishments. Today, they speak about inflation, And they speak about it without any nuance or any context, and they refuse to put forth serious solutions. They use their platforms to discourage people from getting vaccinated, which will only prolong pandemic-induced inflation. They spread lies that the Build Back Better Act will add to the deficit, despite 3 years ago enthusiastically passing Trump's tax break for the wealthy bill, knowing it would add $2 trillion to the deficit. I'm tired of the fear-mongering and misinformation, so let's today, in this moment, set the record straight about the Build Back Better Act. Secretary Yellen, please answer yes or no to these questions wherever possible. Would providing universal pre-K and drastically cutting the cost of childcare have a positive impact on the economy?
Yes, I believe it would. It would promote higher labor force participation, and these investments in children would have a significant payoff, making them more successful and better prepared to succeed in our economy.
And would making prescription drugs cheaper for seniors and families have a positive impact on the economy? Yes or no?
Yes, it would certainly cut the cost of living, especially for retirees who have been struggling with the cost of prescription drugs, but many others as well.
And would investing in more affordable housing have a positive impact on the economy? Yes or no?
Yes, I think that's been a very significant problem for decades and has made it exceptionally difficult, especially for lower income families, to manage in expensive parts of the country.
And would the expansion of the child tax credit, a tax cut for the lowest earning families, have a positive impact on the economy? Yes or no?
Yes, and it's already done so in the months after the child tax credit has been paid out. We have seen a substantial decrease in the number of families reporting food insecurity.
So 0 Republicans, 0, voted for the Build Back Better Act, despite it containing substantial, serious, and popular solutions to combat inflation, supply chain issues, and financial hardship, solutions that are fully paid for. To try to justify their no vote, they are spreading lies about this bill. They say the bill will cause long-term inflation. Wrong. That is a falsehood. They say it will add to the deficit. Wrong. That is a falsehood. Anything to delay solutions and distract the public from their government spending hypocrisy. Secretary Yellen, what are the real causes of inflation, and how will policies that stop the spread of COVID-19 and support labor participation help to fight it?
Well, to my mind, the real causes of inflation reflect the impact the pandemic has had on the economy. The programs that have supported income have kept demand at a solid pace and enabled our economy to grow the fastest of any economy, to bring down unemployment toward more normal levels. But because of the pandemic, demand shifted massively away from services and toward goods. That huge demand for goods has resulted in massive supply chain bottlenecks that have crippled our ports and transportation system and caused a shortage of semiconductors that have led to huge increases in the price of new and used vehicles. And because of the pandemic, a substantial number of workers have not returned to the labor force, I believe because they are concerned about the health consequences of working in face-to-face type jobs, and probably also because of childcare concerns.
Secretary Yellen, in the remaining time I have, I do want to give you the floor to talk about the revenue-raising provisions that will pay for the Build Back Better Act's investments. How will they both make wealthy corporations? Sorry, I yield.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both Chairman Powell and Secretary Yellen for being with us today. Congratulations to Chairman Powell on your reappointment. Secretary Yellen, I'll start with you. Earlier you said, and I think you've said it in different ways a few times, when supply and demand get out of balance, you can have inflation, and the demand side has accelerated while we still have supply chain bottlenecks. Fair?
The demand has been strong. Demand has also shifted
Right.
away from services and toward goods, which has created huge problems, more than the aggregate level of demand.
Yes, ma'am. And the American Rescue Plan, which was a partisan bill, that juiced supply, or I'm sorry, that increased demand, which you testified to, did it do anything to alleviate supply issues?
It didn't have substantial impacts on supply.
So when we say that, and this is my frustration, for a year plus, we negotiated in good faith bipartisan legislation to be targeted and appropriate with respect to our response to COVID-19. You all won the election. It's your prerogative to ignore Republican concerns. But you went forward with the American Rescue Plan, which we warned would increase inflation, specifically for the reasons the Secretary just said. It would increase demand and do nothing to alleviate supply chain bottlenecks. That's exactly what happened. You're set to repeat the exact same mistake with Build Back Better. Chairman Powell, I want to commend you for retiring the term transitory as it relates to inflation. My constituents have been complaining about it for over a year. Two concerns. One, inflation is particularly hard on low and middle income Americans, in particular those with fixed incomes. We all know that. It's been brutal for them. Two, and I think this is the new risk accumulates over time the longer rates are at zero, as anyone who invests money and discounts cash flows at a zero interest rate can justify virtually any investment. As we've seen that in various asset bubbles have built up over time, so now I think the risk shifts. Now I believe the risk is that we have let inflation run too hot for too long, and we're in need of a more sudden course correction, which you suggested yesterday. That being the case, what are you most concerned with when considering the ramifications of the taper on the market and the economy at large? What pockets of risk are you looking at as the taper begins?
Let me just say, I think that the taper need not be a disruptive event in markets. I don't expect that it will be. It hasn't been so far. We've telegraphed it. I mean, I think if you look at the state of the economy, look at where we are, look at the most recent run of data, you can see that the highly accommodative policy that we have, even after the taper is done, it's really appropriate that we taper. And as I mentioned yesterday,
I agree,
in my view, it's appropriate that we consider at the next meeting tapering faster so that it wraps up a few months earlier.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I would encourage you, and my concern again is we've seen asset bubbles accumulate over the course of the pandemic. Investors have done incredibly well. I think we should be tapering. I agree with Van in a lot of ways on the monetary front. But I suspect that there's risk building up, and I just want to make sure that it's on the Fed's radar. I want to shift to I have a minute and 26 seconds to see if we get this out. So in recent months, Americans have unfortunately seen energy prices significantly increase, especially at the pump. Some people who talk on Twitter have claimed that this is due to greedy corporations and speculators driving up prices. Do you believe that's the reason for increased gas prices?
So energy is a global market, and there are many, many factors at work there, I would say. It's a combination of very strong demand across the board,
Not
and a number of
greedy
supply-side factors, too.
Not greedy corporations and speculators driving up prices. That's not accurate for why energy prices are high.
You know, looking at this from an economic perspective, it's very strong demand in the face of what have been some supply blockages and a little bit of discipline on the part of the providers.
Thank you. I agree. In the summer of 2020, the Federal Reserve updated its statement of longer-run goals and monetary policy strategy to state that the Fed would seek to achieve inflation above 2% for some time period. Do you have any second thoughts on that, given that we've seen inflation persist for quite some time? And how would, if we didn't change the framework, how would you potentially have responded differently throughout the pandemic?
So the sort of overarching fact of monetary policy in the last 15 years and probably the next 15 years is just that interest rates are significantly closer to the effective to zero. And in that world, it's hard to support the economy and attain growth and maximum employment and 2% inflation. So the framework was designed to address a situation in that. Now, what we have here is a unique historical shock, which is the beginning of the pandemic, the middle of it, and the end of it. And so you have a different situation and we have a different part of the framework that deals with that.
The gentleman's time has
Thank
expired.
you. I'll follow up in writing. Thank you.
I'd be glad to.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman, and thank you both for being here. President Biden stated with your renomination, Chairman, that you would use your authority to address the threat that climate changes poses to our financial system. As you know, if we allow temperatures to rise above another 2 degrees this century, we are surrendering the planet and our environment to corporate polluters, accepting, of course, the disruption to our agriculture, our trade, migration on a massive, unprecedented scale, and the devastating public health impacts. And Chairman, you should know this is so personal for me because I'm seeing it firsthand in Michigan, where Wayne County hasn't met Clean Air Act standards since 2013. This is the largest populated county in Michigan. And not only with record floods that have impacted families during the pandemic, you're talking about 4 times alone to some households over the summer. It is devastating. We need to do something about it, and I know it directly impacts our economy. So Chairman Powell, can you outline precisely what your plan is to fulfill that commitment to address climate risks to our financial system?
I'd be glad to. So the Fed has a couple of ways that we will address climate that are important, but they're not by themselves going to be enough. The first of which is just to supervise and regulate financial institutions, particularly the large ones, to make sure that they understand the risks that they're running and can manage them. The second really is, from a financial stability standpoint, climate change has potentially significant effects on financial stability and also on the broader economy. So we do a lot of research. Our researchers are some of the ones around the globe who are doing the original research to understand the pathway of climate change through the financial system and the economy. And those are within our mandate to supervise firms and look after financial stability. We will be incorporating climate change very much into those mandates.
So you know, and I know you've heard it, between 2016 to 2020, banks provided, $3.8 trillion in direct fossil fuel financing, with most of that investment coming from banks that are holding companies under the Fed's supervision. And I know you're talking about oversight here. But the acting controller of the currency, Michael Hsu, has announced that the OCC plans to issue supervisory guidance on climate risk by the end of the year. Chairman, does the Fed intend to join this guidance? Why or why not?
I don't think we'll join this specific guidance. We're very much tracking and in discussions with the OCC. I think we will move to certainly to provide guidance, and I think we all the agencies want to have consistent or identical ideally guidance. I don't think we'll actually be in a position to join this specific guidance at this time, but we'll get there.
And you know the OCC will also begin examining how large banks are addressing climate risk as part of the examination starting in 2022. So does the Fed plan on conducting a similar assessment in 2022? And what is the Fed planning to do on assessing climate risk to banks face in 2022?
So in 2022, we're already deep into dialogue, and again, particularly with the largest financial institutions. That's really where a lot of the work is going on right now. Ongoing dialogue with all of them, and they are, by the way, they're doing the same thing we're doing, just trying to understand the implications of climate change for their business model, for the things that they do, and also what we're thinking about is what's the appropriate supervisory approach? How do we do this? Which tools do we use? For example, climate scenario analysis.
And I just, on behalf of my residents, I hope dialogue turns into guidance and accountability. Finally, I'm glad you've allowed the leadership of other central banks, in joining, you joined the network for greening the financial system last year. Really appreciate it, but as Governor Bernard has indicated, the U.S. still trails other countries in, quote, measuring, monitoring, managing climate-related financial risks. And we need to, quote, governor said, we need to catch up. And they go on to say, Chairman Powell, about how far back we are in regards to having much more active role. And so, Chairman Powell, the European Central Bank has announced the climate risk will guide its monetary policy. Will the Federal Reserve do the same? Are you actually aggressively looking at taking this kind of a approach?
So I mean, I'm focused on the United States and
that
our
a no?
existing mandates.
Is that a no?
Well,
It's no right now.
it's a sort of
So
a broader
maybe?
question than a yes or no.
I mean, they're saying, okay, we're going to use climate risk to guide our monetary
Okay,
policy.
well, on specifically narrowly then, I would say we're not doing that now. I think that's something we'll do in the longer run, but no, we're not doing it.
Not now, okay. As a result of the ECB's initial supervisory review revealed that the banks face material risks from climate risk, yet have failed to meet the supervisor expectations laid out by the regulators. Chairman Powell, do you have a similar comprehensive information about how U.S. banks are positioned on? I'll submit the question.
We're developing that.
You are good.
We're in the
That's
development
excellent.
phase on that.
The
Okay,
gentlewoman's
thank you.
time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, I have a few questions. If Build Back Better becomes law, which earlier you stated it was paid for, and one of the tools for payment was enhanced collections from the IRS, if this does become law, would you anticipate that more Americans will be audited by the IRS?
Sorry, I would anticipate that many fewer Americans with incomes below $400,000 will be audited, that the IRS will have the resources to direct their audits in those places where we have every reason to believe that taxpayers are not paying what's due. That's high-income Americans and complex partnerships and corporations where the sources of income are opaque and the audit rates have dropped to historically low levels. The auditing will be focused in those areas. Those areas are what account for a $7 trillion tax gap over the next decade.
And you think we need 87,000 new IRS employees for that?
The auditing staff of the IRS has declined. The skill level of the auditing force has declined substantially. It's critical to hire people who have the expertise to conduct these complex audits, but the hiring will also improve customer service. The customer service at the IRS has fallen to unacceptably low levels.
I'll agree with you there. Thank you for that, for those answers. Back to inflation. In March, you said fears that the administration's $2 trillion relief bill could trigger a rapid rise in inflation are misplaced, that those fears were misplaced. And we heard earlier today that that was quite a large factor in where we are today with respect to inflation. I realize you're selling this plan as great for the future and with calming these inflation fears, but isn't it difficult for us to accept, perhaps, on my side of the aisle, that we are not going to just continue to kick the can down the road and make things worse when your predictions were so wrong back in February? Do you really not think that spending another several $1 trillion will...
So first of all, we're talking about a decade. We're not talking about a single year. The spending from the American Rescue Plan, which was $1.9 trillion, was largely concentrated this year. So Build Back Better is a decade-long plan. It is a small plan relative to the total size of the economy and GDP over a decade, and it's paid for. So it does not involve an increase in deficits according to a combination of CBO and Treasury reckoning over the next decade. And beyond that, it puts in place investments that will continue to bring down deficits. And finally, I'd say it will improve the supply side of the economy, which is, in the long run, a factor that will tend to mitigate ongoing inflationary pressures.
Thank you. And Chairman Powell, would you agree with that analysis that this increased spending, these multiple trillions of dollars over the next year, will that help us get to that point that we're at in the end of next year where you see inflation reducing?
I'm sorry, we really don't comment on existing legislation. It's kind of it's kind of out of bounds for us. This is what the CBO will do. They will make an estimate.
So then, just to confirm your discussion with Congressman Zeldin, your analysis that the inflationary numbers are anticipated to perhaps reduce at the end of next year, that's based on this Build Back Better passing?
So we have to see the final bill and how much of it is paid for. You got to look at the spending in the first couple of years. You got to look at exactly how much of it is paid for to really make a sophisticated judgment about that. But it is 10 years of spending, right? So I'm really reluctant to get pulled into to commenting on something that we don't really have the final facts on.
Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Welcome back, Secretary Yellen. Welcome back, Chair Powell. Chair Powell, congratulations on your renomination as Fed Chair. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have spent a tremendous amount of time attacking the Build Back Better Act as wasteful spending that will increase the deficit and fuel inflation, as we've seen through this conversation. I, of course, disagree with that. Not only is this legislation paid for, but it makes critical long-term overdue investments that will improve productivity and address the supply chain bottlenecks causing part of the cause of heightened inflation. The Build Back Better Act critically makes investments close to more than $7 trillion projected 10-year tax gap that is largely due to tax evasion by the wealthy and by corporations. I'm reminded of the quote by Benjamin Franklin, there are only two things certain, death and taxes. However, we know from reality, Secretary Yellen, you've spoken about this, that taxes are not certain for everybody, and it's time we made a fair, equal playing field. So rather than the boogeyman of 87,000 agents coming after hardworking Americans, could we be clearer? What are the ways that wealthy individuals and corporations fail to pay taxes? In some cases, it's not everybody, we know that. How do some avoid or fail to pay taxes? And that's what we're trying to go after.
Well, the rates of compliance for income streams that have third-party reporting to the IRS, like wages and salaries, 95, 97, 98, something like that percentage of income is reported and taxes are paid as due.
Can you
so
paint a
that's
picture?
not where the problem is.
Yeah.
The problem is opaque sources of income. When individuals earn income that isn't wage and salary income, the IRS doesn't know about it, they have to rely on the honesty of the taxpayer to report what they've earned. They don't have additional sources of information. And for complex partnerships and for companies, similarly, the sources of income and amounts are opaque. And if we had high auditing rates, that would probably promote more honest reporting. But audit rates have dropped to unbelievably low levels over the last decade. And so the investment in the IRS to enhance its auditing capacity, not only will that directly enable greater tax collections, but a lot of research shows that it will improve honesty in reporting in the first place when the odds of being audited rise.
And that would be valuable because, as Treasury has estimated, the tax gap could be as high as $7 trillion over the next decade, in the future decade. How that much money is currently falling through the cracks, and we here in Congress wouldn't want to address that, is staggering to me. Chair Powell, in the remaining time that I have, when you appeared before this committee in July, I asked you about the need for greater public and private investment. You talked about how investment raises the potential growth rate, increasing productivity, and raising living standards. I also asked you about the impact of supply chain vulnerabilities on inflation, which you repeatedly testified to be one of the major drivers of inflation. As part of the Build Back Better Act, I worked to include a language to increase our investment in domestic manufacturing and support supply chain resiliency. Ultimately, this legislation took the form of authorizing $500 million for the use of the Defense Production Act for the purposes of supporting manufacturing right here. Chair Powell, how would this kind of domestic investment in manufacturing address continued supply chain challenges and combat inflation?
Madam Chair, I'm going to have to decline. I don't want to get into commenting on particular aspects of this specific bill. It's just not our role. It's not that we don't have the capability to do it. It's just we really have to respect that we're not part of fiscal policy. We do our jobs.
That. How about the fact if we can encourage and create greater domestic manufacturing, not speaking of the legislation then, what would that do in terms of inflation?
Well, a significant part of the inflation that we're seeing is due to longer length supply chains from Asia. So to the extent, I mean, as a factual matter, if you made things locally here in this particular situation, you'd see lower inflation. But by the time
thank you, and I have to gavel myself off because my time has expired. Thank you, Chair Powell. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Madam Secretary, I want to, without trying to be too much as it were that we're fighting each other here over politics, I found it very interesting that your remarks wanted to be in line with the administration of which you serve as a cabinet officer, but it gets confusing for a member of Congress and I believe the American people to speak directly to the facts of the case or the truth that we would decide. You have used the word a couple times, honesty and reporting, I believe 3 times today. Your reference to this Build Back Better is being completely paid for, but then you put a caveat there, but CBO did not report it that way because of the revenue that might come in from whatever today we're hearing 80 or 87,000 new IRS agents. What am I, as a member of this committee, to take away the position of the Treasury Department as they properly respond to questions from members of Congress or the media about the truth of the matter? Are you in favor of your view of the Build Back Better or the CBO score?
So we respect the CBO and agree with the CBO analysis of those portions of the bill that CBO scored. CBO reported that over the next decade, the aggregate deficit resulting from the bill would be $367 billion.
Yes, ma'am.
But
And
they
that
also
this is
made
my point.
clear-
I don't want to argue with you, so are you
So that
suggesting?
is correct.
So do you think it's
coincides-
fair that you would, and the administration, would continue the dialogue? It's completely paid for, but
I think that's complete. I'm sorry.
The honesty in reporting is Congress looks at the CBO.
Well, Congress has to look at the footnotes in the CBO report as well. And CBO made clear that their score did not include any revenue from additional IRS enforcement. They made that completely clear in their written report.
Yes, ma'am.
And they have an estimate of what that would be, but they have also stated previously that their methodology assumes very little shift in the behavior of taxpayers. And the Treasury Department has its own analysis, and there are outside researchers who have analysis of what the impact of these IRS resources will be. Our estimate, Treasury's estimate, is that it will generate $400 billion over 10 years, And if you combine that with CBO's estimate of the remainder, which is a deficit of 367, those two things come out in positive territory.
So you want a Rube Goldberg drawing, if this happens, if this happens, if this happens, then we, as the administration, can say, and the president with a masked face can say, it's paid for. But in fact, honesty in reporting is what ought to be. So I still would disagree with the gentlewoman. You're the Treasury Secretary. I am not. You're entitled to your opinion. I still think that because the honesty in reporting is necessary, it would be honest to say, and CBO does not concur. Because I believe it's important to tell people, by and large, the truth. The truth of the matter is that you will be adding 87,000 net new employees to a department that may take 5 or 6 years to materialize. Another question, please, ma'am. How many IRS agents, I apologize, I've exceeded my time. I will provide in writing a request to you, and I want to thank the gentlewoman, the chairwoman, for the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell for being with us today. One of the things that I also wanted to focus in on is the very important topic of climate change in terms of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve's role in that. The United States just returned from COP26 in Glasgow, and where participating nations agreed to reduce carbon emissions in order to remain within the 1.5 degrees Celsius benchmark as acknowledged by the Paris Agreement. The Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC, recently released a report exploring the risks that climate change poses to our financial system. And while it is the first time that FSOC has designated climate change as a threat to U.S. financial stability, I was disappointed to see that the report, which is intended to serve as a blueprint for federal regulators, makes no mention of any timelines or policies needed to stay within that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. As a matter of fact, the FSOC report, in discussing climate change, doesn't discuss the 1.5 degrees Celsius target at all. And instead, its focus is on general data disclosure and review. Secretary Yellen, can you explain why the report fails to make mention of globally acknowledged targets for climate to prevent further climate change degradation?
Well, FSOC's mission and responsibility is to identify threats to financial stability of the United States and to coordinate across regulatory agencies to make sure that they're addressed. Treasury is also involved with the administration in trying to put in place policies, economic policies, tax policies, spending policies that will address climate change itself. And of course, very substantial policies are included in Build Back Better, and the infrastructure plan also contain policies that address climate change and are oriented toward trying to meet our commitment to the 1.5% target.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. As a general note, I do think it's important that, perhaps we consider the fact that there are substantially different financial risks between 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees, and beyond. But, when we look at some of our partners around the world, Sweden's Riksbank will only purchase bond holdings from companies complying with their climate standards. The Swiss Central Bank has announced that they will exclude coal investments from its massive holdings. The European Central Bank conducts stress testing with respect to climate. Do you believe that the United States is behind the rest of the world when it comes to mitigating the risk climate change poses to our financial system and the commitments we're willing to make to do so?
I take it you're asking me that question. Or were you asking Secretary Yellen?
Oh, I apologize. Yes. Well, I was asking Secretary Yellen, but Chairman Powell, you're welcome to weigh in as well.
Thank you. So, I mean, I'm really focused on our domestic context and doing what we think is right under our laws and our authorities as the Fed. And I would say that principally what we're working on is regulation and supervision of the largest financial institutions and also financial stability more broadly.
And a May report from the International Energy Agency found that new fossil fuel exploration and extraction was incompatible with a 1.5 degrees Celsius objective, and that, quote, there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in our net zero pathway. And with respect to the U.S. mitigating the catastrophic impacts of essentially going beyond 1.5, potentially going beyond 2 degrees Celsius, do we agree, or Secretary Yellen, do you agree with this assessment that we should consider phasing out investments in new fossil fuel supplies?
So I certainly learned a lot from the IEA report and have no basis to question their judgment. You know, as Chair Powell indicated, the FSOC's mission and the Fed's mission is safety and soundness of financial institutions, and we don't have authority to tell institutions that they must pursue lending policies that support the Paris commitment. But it is very noticeable that at Glasgow, all of the major global financial institutions voluntarily committed to align their lending with the Paris commitments, and certainly at Treasury we'll be monitoring very closely their performance, and we're heartened to see these important commitments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Chair and Secretary, for appearing before the committee. And like my colleagues, Chairman Powell, congratulations on your renomination for another term. I would acknowledge to you, I'm not sure the President did you a favor, but thank you for being willing to do this again. That said, let's talk about a number of issues, and I'll try and roll through them in some sort of a concise fashion. Since the onset of the pandemic, the United States has added more than $5 trillion to its total national debt, standing at about $29 trillion. And as the Secretary's alluded to, apparently we need to raise the debt ceiling very soon to address that even. And that doesn't count the extra trillions that have gone on the Federal Reserve System's balance sheet. The U.S. is now set to exceed the debt-to-GDP ratio not seen since the end of the Second World War. Chairman Powell, speak to us from a macroeconomic perspective. When's the right time to prioritize the threat of U.S. debt rapidly outpacing economic growth? We spent a lot of money in the last couple of years.
And, you know, as I generally would say, and as is appropriate, I think, for me to say in my role, the U.S. needs to get back on a sustainable fiscal path. The right time to do that is when the economy is strong, when the taxes are rolling in, when employment is high. And the right way to do it is to have a longer-term plan to get to get the economy growing faster than the debt. By definition, it's unsustainable to have the debt ultimately growing faster than the economy, and we have that now.
Chairman, you and I were both young men in the Carter-Reagan period under your predecessor, Chairman Volcker, when we went through an inflationary cycle that was even more horrendous than this, and the effort that it took to bring that period to a conclusion. I guess I'd like to visit for a moment just about the fundamental issues. Again, not addressing particular legislation, just the fundamental issues. The amount of money through congressional activity that we put into circulation. And in 2020, I think in a bipartisan way, we voted an incredible amount of money out of this place because the wheels were coming off in the spring and summer of 2020 with COVID. And no one wanted to return to a 1929, 1941 period. So we were willing to do whatever it took. But that now brings us to this point of addressing inflation and getting a grip on that. Could you describe how policy, and I know you don't comment on legislation, but how policymakers at the Fed evaluate the results of these kind of forecasts on the economy?
So what we're really looking at is so many things cause inflation, but really it's an imbalance between supply and demand in the real economy. That's what it's about. And we actually see fiscal stimulus, the stimulative aspect of fiscal policy is actually declining and will turn into a headwind next year. You got to distinguish between the change and the level, if you will. So as deficits are coming down overall, you're going to see less in the way of fiscal stimulus to grow off of this high level of growth that we have. We had a very stimulative 2020, if that makes sense.
So the buzz will lead to a hangover, yes.
So, what we're looking at is another strong year next year. Most forecasters see strong growth, but they also see the supply chains getting untangled, and they see the economy, supply side rising to meet strong demand. And we see inflation coming down. Again, it's not a certainty, it's a forecast.
But the balancing act of policymakers, as the supply increases, we still have to address the money that's available to chase those few resources, or this process won't come to an end. Turning to you, Secretary, we've discussed, several of my colleagues have climate-related issues. I am concerned, coming from a district that produces lots of different forms of energy and consumes massive amounts of different forms of energy, that when the majority can't pass a bill to outlaw certain forms of energy, and they can't pass a bill to tax it to death, that the route they're going to take is use regulatory policy to strangle the capital available to those industries. Could you touch on that for a moment? Is it the intention of the regulators to create standards such that banks cannot support any particular energy industry that may ask for capital, that may justify a loan?
Well, as chair of FSOC, I would say our focus is on financial stability, and the regulators, like the Federal Reserve, are focused on safety and soundness of institutions, and that means making sure they hold adequate capital to
There's a fascinating
manage
report
the
from the New York
risk.
Fed.
It's not
I hope you'll review. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and of course, I thank you and the ranking member for convening this hearing. And of course, thank you to our witnesses for joining us today to discuss the CARES Act oversight and our pandemic response. From when we passed the CARES Act until today, we've made remarkable progress. Our recovery has been impressive, especially compared to other countries, but it has been uneven and unequal as well. It's our job to fix that. Secretary Yellen, I represent a working class immigrant district, including many families with children. In fact, one of the youngest districts in the country. The stimulus checks and the child tax credit were vital in my community. That's why I fought so hard to ensure that mixed status families and ITIN holders are finally able to access these vital benefits in the American Rescue Plan. More than half of Latino children have at least one immigrant parent, and at least 90% of these children are U.S. citizens, meaning they're entitled to these benefits, but they often can't get them. The question for you, millions of ITINs have expired at the end of last year, and the ITIN process is plagued by delays. Sometimes the IRS holds on to original documents for months, a terrifying prospect for an immigrant family. What are Treasury and the IRS doing to streamline the application process for ITIN filers?
Well, I can get back to you or have my staff with greater detail on this, but We have been trying to speed the delivery, for example, of the child tax payments to individuals who didn't file a return in either 2019 or 2020. Many ITINs may be in that category, and it's been an objective of our outreach to make sure that there are tools available to apply for those payments. We made an application available on mobile devices that's in Spanish as well to try to make sure that they receive the payments they're entitled to. But I'd be glad to get back to you with more detail on this.
Thank you. I will take you up on that and follow up with you and your folks. Data shows that Latinos are less likely than whites to report receiving monthly child tax credit payments. This is disturbing since Latino children are more likely to live in poverty. What can Treasury and the IRS do to monitor the success of the tax credit in the Latino community, and what can Congress do to ensure that the tax credit reaches everyone that's entitled to it?
Well, I would just say that we have tried through an extensive outreach program to make sure, and working with members of Congress as well, to make sure that there's awareness, especially in low-income and minority communities, of eligibility for these payments, both the child tax, especially the child tax payments, and it's a question of getting the word out and making sure that families know how to apply.
And do you think that members of Congress have any other role to help ensure that everyone who is eligible gets it?
We have asked members of Congress to help us get the word out. The IRS has had an extensive outreach program, but certainly members of Congress can help publicize the availability of these benefits in their districts.
Thank you, Secretary. I look forward to following up with you and, of course, working together to ensure that these benefits reach every community in this country. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Powell, congratulations on your renomination. I look forward to working with you over your next 4 years. Also, Mr. Chairman Powell, the Fed oversees 753 financial institutions for compliance with numerous measures related to the safety and soundness of the banking system. If one of those institutions chose to not follow a law passed by Congress or a rule the Fed promulgated, the Fed can take a myriad of enforcement actions, including cease and desist orders, removal and prohibition orders, and monetary policies. In other words, if you break the law, there are consequences. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, do you believe the Fed should punish those entities when they decide not to follow the law? Do you believe that the Fed should punish those entities when they don't follow the law, those banks, if they're not following the law?
I guess if they don't follow the law.
Thank you. Well, if you're going to hold the banks and society accountable to the law, then should we also hold cabinet members accountable when they do not follow the law?
Yes.
Thank you for that. Chair Yellen, I am the ranking member of the Small Business Committee, as you well know. The CARES Act put the Secretary of the Treasury in charge of the PPP program. You, by law, were supposed to show up by the end of April 23rd, which is now 222 days, over 7 months, and you have yet to grace the threshold of that committee hearing room and give your report. Why do you continue to ignore and thumb your nose at the Small Business Committee and your job to adhere to the law, which you just said is important as a cabinet member?
Look, I believe that congressional oversight is very important, and that Congress and committees should be partners with us in serving the American people. I have, over the last 10 months, testified 12 times.
Madam
and
Chair,
I will be
Madam
back-
Secretary, with all due respect, you are not answering my question. It's very specific. Yes, you've been able to accommodate every other committee on this Hill, except the Small Business Committee, which you are required by law to show up to. Why are you not there?
Well, I do
Very
have-
specific. Why are you not at the Small Business Ministry?
I do have the ability to delegate responsibilities.
You have not
and I
delegated
have
to anybody yet.
authorized-
There's nobody that's showed up for 222 days now, past the
I have offered my deputy treasury secretary to testify before the committee.
Madam Chair, again, Madam Secretary, with all, between my time, with all due respect, you do not delegate an authority like that. You are required by law to show up. You have spent, as you just said, multiple times, you have been to other hearings across the spectrum of the House and the Senate, and you refuse to come to the Small Business Administration. Is it beneath you to show up at our committee hearing? Against the law, by the way?
You know, the Treasury has had, during the Biden administration, essentially no role in the Paycheck Protection Program.
Well, that's a problem for the Biden administration. It's not the problem of the, it should be, you should be doing your
Small
job.
Business Administration that has responsibility.
No, it does not, Madam
for
Chair. With all due,
conducting-
Madam Secretary, with all due respect, it does not. The CARES Act gave the Secretary of the Treasury authority over that. I spent 2 or 3 weeks, the leadership team of this committee, working with Secretary Mnuchin to put that plan together. It is in your purview. It is in your district. It is your job to oversee that particular program. And it's your job to be able to report on it as per the law. You just thumb your nose at the law over and over again. It can't continue. When are you going, there, as you just said, there should be consequences to cabinet members who do not follow the law. Amazing. It's breathtaking. I've got about a minute left here, so let me move on real quickly here. Chairman Powell, I'm very concerned about the continued investment in China by all of the folks in this country. The investment folks, and it falls under, to me, it falls under monetary policy, but I'll see what your opinion is here. As we continue to throw more money in the economy, it seems like there's more and more money that's shifting over to China, investing in the Chinese bonds, they're investing in their companies, they're investing in their securities. Are you alarmed by this at all? By our investing in China and their economy, which would be competing against us, and will have a direct impact on our economic ability to survive down the road?
Mr. Lukemeyer, we really don't have a role in that. That you maybe think, I mean, the SEC would have a role if investors are investing in Chinese bonds and things like that. That would really be an issue for the SEC, but not so much for us.
Okay, are you concerned about it all, the level of investment over there?
Yeah, I'm mostly concerned about inflation and stable prices and maximum employment here at home.
Okay, well, that investment, I think, would have a dramatic impact because of the money flowing there versus it's flowing back here. To me, it would be able to set up our own supply chains over here to be able to be more helpful. Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for their inclusion in the record. With that, this hearing is adjourned.